Secondary data means the data has already been worked out and it has been published somewhere, it has already been released somewhere. So rating scale is a very, very important methodology. Why? Because it is more from a qualitative perspective rather than a quantitative perspective. Hypothesis means that you are trying to prove something based on an assumption. Good morning and welcome to the model question paper solving of business research method, the 5th semester B.B.A paper. This is a very, very interesting paper and this is the first time the university has introduced this paper. Now moving further, we are going to have the same pattern. We are going to have the 15 marks question 2, 10 marks question 3 and 5 marks question 4, which means the total weightage of this paper is 80 marks. Let's move further and see what are all the probable questions that are likely to come for this particular paper. Starting with the first question, explain the preparation of a business research plan. Now, normally the ideology of setting up a business research plan, what is this business research altogether? First of all, business research is a methodology by which we are trying to achieve some objectives. So when you start explaining this question, you need to start with your objective, then about the scope of the business, then you will start talking about your data collection method, your sampling size, your different ideas of how you're going to collect the data, then your data analysis stage, then you will start understanding the formulation and interpretation of results. Finally, you will prepare the business report and present it to the organization. Nowadays, in the modern world, there are many companies which rely on the business research plan altogether. The reason is quite simple, because they want to get idea about what are the new options, new innovations that are happening. So primarily, a business research is a methodology through which you can go further and you can tell people exactly how we are trying to bring in a better formulation, a better ideology altogether. So this way, I would always say that business research plan is highly, highly important. Followed by the types of the business research design. There are many types of research designs, like when you can talk about the exploratory, the casual, the normative research plan. Now, these are kind of things where we are trying to understand how to construct a business plan or a business research design. Now, exploratory, the word itself tells you very clearly, you are in an ideology, you are in a mood to explore. You want to find out what are all the options that are available in that particular area. So that's why I call it as exploratory design. This is like a fundamental design process where you can involve in the research, where you can try experimenting for some time, come up with a product or service and then make it feasible. Now, when you talk about a casual research design, this is like an informal research where you try to come up with an idea and you see whether the feasibility of the idea is possible. Now, when we talk about the normative research design or a market type, we just go with the flow of the customer and then we come into a research design method. What is that we are trying to understand? What is that we are trying to explore here? Or what is that we are trying to read here is that we are trying to understand the ideology behind the business research design. So do we really need a design for every business? The answer is yes. Why? Because in the modern days, what is happening is that if you look into any of the companies, now let's take for example Maruti Suzuki itself. Over the last 10 years, Maruti has come up with so many different types of models, so many different types of cars. Why have they come up with that? Because they have done a fundamental research in the Indian markets, and they have tried to understand that the consumer is expecting more variants. Now, the price is one side of the story, but the other side is that there is a lot of expectation and demand that comes from the consumer. Now, every expectation and every demand cannot be satisfied, but then the company will take a stand in terms of finding out what kind of new innovation that we can bring it to the market so that we are able to cover the majority of our customers. So in that situation, you go with a business research design. You go back to your fundamental product, you analyze the product, you start understanding how we can remodel it, how we can bring variants, how we can bring changes, how we can design the entire concept. And there you get the answer that the business research design is one of the most powerful factor altogether. For companies which can afford to take time and money with them. Now, for example, when I go back to Maruti Suzuki or Tata Motors, they've been in this business for very, very long years. So they have the time, they have the money, they have the capacity to undergo the research for a long time period. So they undergo a lot of exploratory. They have a separate unit, the R&D division itself, which does a lot of design research format to come up with the best kind of vehicle, the best platform, the kind of engine, the kind of design pattern, the kind of speed, the locomotive factors, everything into it, and then they release a product in the market which is appreciated by the customer. So that's why I would always say this is supposed to be one of the best designs that you can ever talk about in the market. Now, the different types of data and the data collection methods. Now, what is a data? Data is a collection of facts, collection of information. Now, what happens here is that information might be raw. Data is something which is accurate. So when you collect data, you are collecting a specified information and you have to classify the information according to the need and objectives. So when I talk about data, there are two types of data, primary data and secondary data. Now, what is a primary data? The data which is collected by the researcher in the first-hand basis, on a first-hand method, that is a primary data. Now, for example, interview method, telephonic interviews, on the field research or report, or collecting data by going from home to home, understanding it from the respondents, filling up the questionnaire and taking it from the respondent. These are all the primary data collection methods. Why do we call it primary data? Not just because it is taken at the first level, but this is an accurate live data that is taken up by the researcher himself. So there is not much of manipulation here. There is not much of predetermined or pre-esteemed values here. This is something which is collected right from the customer at a first-hand approach basis so that you are able to get the exact information, the exact data that is being collected by a given methodology. When I move to the secondary data, I would like to call it as a published data or the data which is already available for the consumers to go ahead and make use of it, for the researchers to go ahead. Now, you might have the published data in the form of textbooks, journals, or research theses which have been written, the website itself, or you might have reports which have been published from established institution, the various kinds of theses and work, research papers that are published. These are all secondary data. Secondary data means the data has already been worked out and it has been published somewhere, it has already been released somewhere. So making use of a secondary data will also help us to undergo the research and come out with some feasible ideas. So when you go through the collection methods, you try to understand which kind of data do you want to go through, whether you want to go through the primary data or you want to go through the secondary data. So if you're going through the primary data, there is a lot of work that is involved in terms of going to the field, collecting the data, collecting the questionnaire, answering and getting the answer from the people. So it involves a lot of time and effort. Secondary data is something which is very easy, manipulative, and it's already available. So you don't have to worry at all. It is just there. You just have to download it and take it further. So secondary data becomes easier for us in terms of using it in research. But then the challenge that I would say in secondary data is that every time it might not be accurate, every time it might not be updated at all. So it is always a mix and match of primary as well as secondary data methods that the researcher has to use in order to arrive at a conclusion. Moving forward, let's try to understand the concept of hypothesis testing. This is very, very important. First of all, what is this hypothesis? So why people are so much hyped about the hypothesis? Hypothesis means that you are trying to prove something based on an assumption. Now, for example, we are trying to make you understand that in a very simple example, all men like blue color. If I make a statement like that, now this is what I call it as a null hypothesis, H0, where I say that all men like blue color. Now there might be people who will come back and say that no sir, it is not necessary. There are people who like other than the blue color. So there are men in the world who might like green, red, black, whatever colors. So what is this hypothesis? Where we are trying to prove an assumption right or wrong. Now, there are two kinds of hypothesis. One is called as the null hypothesis, which is already pre-assumed, and the other one is called as the alternative hypothesis. So when I say null hypothesis, that means to say that it is already there. So if you are going to prove it wrong, you have to move on to H1, which is called as the alternative hypothesis. Hypothesis is a very, very important statement when it comes to business research. Why? Because using the hypothesis only, we will be able to prove our objectives. Now, if you are just going to do an hypothetical method where you are just going to take the assumptions and just go forward, then it is not possible at all. So what we tend to do, what we tend to understand here is that we will first try to understand the hypothesis. We will first try to see what is that we have got to exactly prove in the research. So how many hypotheses are there? There might be n number of hypotheses. Now, for example, in a research, there might be 10, 15, even 20 hypotheses. So it is for us to take each and every stand of the hypothesis and prove it through the research, whether it is right or wrong. So that's why we call this hypothesis testing a very, very important stage in research, which actually makes the researcher come closer to the conclusion by proving whether what he has assumed is right or wrong. The next one, types of sampling method. Now, the primary research itself, ideology starts with the sampling techniques. What is the sampling techniques? Why do we have to go for a sample? Now let's understand the definition of a sample. Sample means that you have collected a variety of variables, a collection of variables from a given group. So this sampling method will have different types: probability-based sampling, non-probability-based sampling. You are going with a judgmental, quota sampling, stratified sampling, non-stratified sampling. There are different methods. But then, sampling is a method by which you will collect a substantiated amount of data from a given large pool of data or variables available. Why is this sampling method coming into picture? Sampling is a judgmental way, or rather I would like to put in this word, sampling is a methodology by which you are going to understand the characteristics of a large group through a collected sample or to a collected variable group altogether. So for example, you want to understand about the people who are working in IT sector in Bangalore. So what is the average salary of a person who is working in information technology sector in Bangalore? Then what I can do is that I can collect a sample of data from the large number of people who are working in the IT sector in Bangalore. That will give me a fair idea about what is the earning parameter, how much are they earning on an average compared to the whole lot of the Bangalore city. So sampling method gives you different types, where you have a judgmental sampling based on judge, where you have a quota based sampling where you're going to take only a particular quota, or you have a stratified sampling, you have a non-stratified sampling where things are pretty much defined and taken into position. This sampling method is a very, very important technique. Why? Because it puts the researcher on the top gear to make you understand whether exactly a data can work in that manner. Now, that's why when you do a sampling method, you need to be 100% sure about this factor, whether you are taking the exact sample, whether you are taking the right kind of sample or not. Suppose you are trying to do a research, but your sample size does not match to the research and to the needs that have been told there, then the research might not be successful at all. So always when you are doing a sampling method technique, you need to first understand the sample size and the objective of your research are matching. Now, based on that, you will be able to change your sample accordingly and start moving further. Now, there might be questions when you are doing in niche kind of research where the sample size is very small. In that kind of method, what we do is that we go to a judgmental sample basis altogether. Because if the sample size is less, then automatically the scope of the research also comes down. So we go into a judgmental methodology there. Now, data analysis, a very, very important step in research. You have collected the data, you have tabulated the data, you have put it across in a particular format in a manner, now you have applied a formula. Now comes the time called as analysis. You need to analyze the data that you have collected, and then only you will be able to get a meaningful interpretation of the data. Now, there are people, what they tend to do is that they just collect the data, group it and put it across in a tabular column. But what is the meaning of the data? How am I going to make an inference out of the data that is being collected? So for the researcher, he needs to apply an appropriate formula through which the result that is going to be interpreted is understandable for the consumers as well as the people who are going to go through the research. Now, 90% of the time, what we tend to do is that we believe that research is only for ourselves. Research is only for the researcher. Nobody else is interested in the research. That's a pre-assumption that we have in our mind. But the reality is that there are so many people who are interested to understand about your research. So unless and until you have a clear-cut analysis method by which you are able to tell the people clearly what is the type of data you have taken, what is the meaning of the data, in what quantity, in what variability, what size, in what levels, what are the units that have been used, how you have scaled the data, what parameters you have followed in calculating the data, all these methods will definitely matter a lot, because then only the research becomes meaningful. So at any given point of time, data analysis is the most crucial step in business research method. Why? Because when the design is completed, when you're going to publish your research analysis, this data analysis part will help you to prove on a statistical, quantitative and qualitative method, saying that these are the steps which I have followed in order to come to a meaningful result or a meaningful situation altogether. So data analysis, a very, very important step which is being used in the business research methods. Now let's move on to the 5 markers. Now, what are the 5 markers questions that can probably come? There are very, very few 5 markers which I would like to tell you which are likely to come for you. One is called as the problem formulation. Now, the question itself is quite interesting. So normally they give the problem, why we have to formulate a problem. The answer is here. The problem formulation is a stage or a step in business research where you first try to understand the problem, understand the challenge of the research. It is not that you are just going to write a statement, but you need to formulate a sentence, an objective, a problem that which you think as a challenge to your research. Now, for example, I want to understand the impact of knowledge management in healthcare professional. Now, that is a problem statement. I just want to understand the impact of knowledge management factor. I want to understand the impact of online education in the upcoming generation. So what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to take online education as a system, as a challenge, as a factor, how far it is reachable, how it is trying to go and make an impact. So problem formulation is not just a statement, but it is about the challenge. It's about the underlying cause, underlying concept, which you have to address through your research. So it is very, very important for all of us to first understand what is the problem, what is the challenge, what is the factor under which we are going through, so that you will be able to attain that problem formulation. Once the problem formulation statement is being done, then based on that you will be able to go towards your objectives, your scope, your nature of the data, and then you start sampling and going forward in terms of your research altogether. Followed by write a note on different types of errors. So there are different types of errors that comes into picture. Now there are something like a type 1 error, type 2 error, standard errors, which are quite possible in a research. Now it is very evident that why? Because every one of us in this world are prone to make errors because we are human beings. We are not machines or robots that every time we will get it precisely right. So what happens in the research format is that there might be errors which are related to data. There might be errors which are related to the oversight of collection of data, or the application of formula, or the sampling, or in terms of predicting the results, or in terms of conclusion, or in terms of assumptions of the problem statement. So there are different types of errors that can come in. Now when I talk about this type 1, type 2 errors, these are kind of things where there is a fundamental problem in terms of understanding the data or in terms of the application of the research. So these are the types of errors that we are talking about. Rating scale. Now this is a very, very interesting thing. How do you do a rating scale? So normally when you go through your apps and mobile, there would be stars given: 1 star, 2 star, 3, 4 and 5. How do you rate our app? So moment you say a 5, that means you're giving a 5-star rating. Moment you give a 3, that's a 3-star rating. Rating scale is a methodology through which you are rating, giving an appraisal to a particular activity or to a particular question that is being asked to you. So rating scale is a very, very important methodology. Why? Because it is more from a qualitative perspective rather than a quantitative perspective. There are many questions, especially in the field of human resources, human psychology, organizational behavior. You will see a lot of rating scales which is being used to interpret the situation, the emotion, the behavior of an employee or of a human being. So we cannot take every time numbers. We cannot say that, which is quantifiable by saying 30%, 40% or 50%. We need a rating. A is bigger than B, or B is bigger than C, or A is better than B, better than C. At that point of time, I need certain rating scale. So when I say 4 out of 5, 7 out of 10, 9 out of 10, that means there is a rating. There is some standards on which I am rating this particular incident, particular behavior altogether. So the rating scale gives me a standard level. It makes me understand. So these are the levels of expectation. These are the levels of outcome that has been done altogether. Followed by write a note for need of questionnaire, or the need for questionnaire. Questionnaire is not something new to us at all. We have all been following the questionnaire and been accustomed to questionnaire from ages. What is this questionnaire about? A sample set of questions which have been neatly, concise, designed for the consumer to understand and give his response. Questionnaire is the easiest method of collecting the responses. Why? Because there are predetermined answers which are already put. The customer has to just give in the response altogether, and the response will be recorded later by the researcher in the form of an Excel sheet. Now, the questionnaire is a typically designed set of questions, say 10 questions, 15 or 20 questions, which will have options A, B, C, and D, or a rating scale base. And the questionnaire primarily targets to collect the responses rather than the information. So whatever kind of questions you want to know about the subject, about the area of your research, can be typed in the form of a questionnaire and be presented to the customer. The customer can give his responses according to his knowledge. Now, the challenges in questionnaire is this. Suppose if I do not know anything about the subject, I would have just ticked all the questions out of a hindsight knowledge, or I would have just closed my eyes and just ticked it on a random basis. So what happens in questionnaire is that every time you cannot expect accuracy, and many a times people might not feel it happy enough, or they might not feel really actively involved in solving or answering the questionnaire. They might just give you some rough answers, some blunt answers altogether. So that's why questionnaire has its own advantages and disadvantages. So whenever you're using a questionnaire, you need to calibrate, you need to understand whether the answers that you have got are matching up to your expectations, or it is that people have just run through your questions and tick the same option. So questionnaire, definitely an important methodology that is used in the business research methods. With this, I come to the conclusion of today's session. I hope and believe that all the questions discussed would be of a great help and resource to you for the upcoming examination. I would like to wish the students all the very best for the people who are writing the business research method question paper. Thank you once again for joining me today on this wonderful session, and have a great day.